Hello, welcome to In Harmony with Nature. My name is Peter Shatlock, and I'll be the host for this episode. In the studio today we have, I guess you might call him one of our regulars now. He's Andrew Hebda. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thank you.
Andrew's done a number of shows with us. I guess it was at least a couple on phosphorus. He's done 2 or 3 on different species of fish, the biology of these species. And he brought his son in. We did one on bats. It's always an experience with Andrew in the studio. With the bats, little brown bats, we found they had little brown fleas. And as I say, we never know exactly what's going to go on during the show. Andrew's helped us out with hosting on a couple of occasions. But tonight we've asked him back to talk about another species of fish. So again, Andrew, welcome, and the show is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I assure you there'll be no little jumping fleas or anything like that this evening to distract.
Did you say no kidding?
No kidding. No kids either. Yes. No, we had a kid, a baby goat in here about a month or so back, but not on screen.
No.
What I'll be talking about today is actually another of our famous Nova Scotia species of fish, and that's the yellow perch. This is one of those that was named back around the turn of the previous century, around the 1814, 1815s, by a gentleman by the name of Mitchell, and the species is the yellow perch. The scientific name is Perca flavescens. And again, the name has a little bit of history to it. The generic name, Perca, refers to the coloration of the fish, and it means dusky. And it says in an ancient language, but it doesn't say which ancient language. I assume ancient English, perhaps Saxon or something like that. I'm not sure. And flavescens, the species name, refers to a yellowish color. And if you actually look at a perch, you'll see that on the surface, the perch is dark, sort of olivey green, and it grades down through a series of bars on its side and to the underside, which is yellow. And one of the characteristics that you can identify it by, as compared to most other fish within the province, is the coloration of the 2 sets of fins that you see towards the front. Now, one is the one just back of the gill cover. That's called the pectoral fin. You can see it's orange. Actually, there's one fin on either side. And the ones just a bit further back, but down below, those are called the pelvic fins. And they're also orange. They're bright orange. So it's the only fish that we have in freshwater that actually has that nice distinct coloration. The other points there are that they have, I think, between 7 to 9 dark bars on their sides. And if you notice on the back of the fish there, you have the 2 sets of fins on the dorsal fins, and they're split between. They're not joined together as we had, for example, with the bass. And unlike the trout, I don't know if you recall those. The trout have an additional little fin on the tail end of it, just above the tail. It's called an adipose fin. So, anyways, this is the lovely little Perca flavescens. It's found quite commonly distributed throughout Nova Scotia, as throughout North America, and the genus, in fact, throughout the world. Now, there's a little publication I picked up a couple of years back called Sports Afield, and what they did is they took each family of fish and they clumped them together, took nice pictures of these of sketches, and then they assigned each a coat of arms. Now, the slide that we've got coming up now shows the other species that are within the family in North America. The yellow perch itself is in the middle on the left-hand side. And again, you can see the characteristic orange fins. On the top is a small fish called a log perch, and down at the bottom is a fish called a walleye, which we don't have in Nova Scotia. And so you can see the large walleye on the mock plate with a little coat of arms for the family Percidae over on the right. I assure you the Office of Heraldry knows nothing about this, but it's a nice little touch. And so you can see that they all have similar characteristics in that they have the split between the 2 fins. And if you look at the heads are very similar to each other. Excuse me. Now, in Europe, they have a very closely related species. It's called Perca fluviatilis, I think, which is the fluviatile or the stream type, flowing type perch. And you can see it's very similar to the perch that we have, with several small exceptions. One is that you notice the fin on the bottom at the back. That's called an anal fin. Nothing rude, I assure you. It's also bright orange in color, and it's perhaps just a little bit more stout through the middle, just back of the operculum. But essentially, except for those small differences, it's very similar to what we have here right now.
Yeah, the stripes are really distinctive.
Quite distinctive, yeah. Always count your stripes before you catch your fish or before you land your fish. And up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see there's a bit of an indication of some of the types of food that are consumed by, in this case, the European perch. There are some of these in North America. Some were introduced. We don't have any in Nova Scotia itself, though. Now, looking at this map, you can see what I mean by the family is quite widespread across the world. Most of what you see in North America is the yellow perch, and you can see it follows up along the tree line right up to, well, you can see right up to the Mackenzie Delta in the Hudson's Bay. The odd spots to the point west. This is the famous or infamous stocking crazes that occur from time to time. And throughout Europe, you can see again the European perch is somewhat very broadly spread again, tied into a variety of factors. It's interesting that it doesn't actually occur on the west coast of North America or the east coast of the Asian and European continents. You can have an east coast on the European continent. I'll have to think about that one. Within North America itself, this is an illustration from the Freshwater Fishes of Canada by Dr. Scott and Crossman. The shaded area shows specifically where you find them and which watersheds you find them. And in little old Nova Scotia, hanging off on the right there, you can see by the illustration that only the mainland is colored in and not Cape Breton. And as far as I know, they haven't been introduced to Cape Breton yet, although it's not inconceivable that they're there right now. They have an advantage over one of the other species we talked about a couple of months back, that's over the bass, in that they have a tolerance for brackish water. You can find them in water that has up to 15 parts per thousand salt. Salinities. Seawater, open seawater is what, 30, 32 in that range. So that's gives it a lot of flexibility. So as a result of that, you can actually see it's distributed right along the Atlantic seaboard and around places, which makes it quite surprising that we haven't found it within Cape Breton per se. But
in the Bredor Lakes would be ideal for it.
Well, yes, they could certainly survive there, but the Bredor Lakes are ideal for other fish as well. So you get into this question of who likes what best and who's there first and better at elbowing their way around.
What are the little black dots for on the map there?
Those are specific sampling locations. These maps were compiled from collections within the Royal Ontario Museum and University of Toronto, who had a fisheries laboratory at the time. So each dot represents a sample that was taken and is actually archived within the ROM. If you ever get a chance to, here's a plug, ever get a chance to go to the Royal Ontario Museum, and they have an excellent collection. The collections that we have here within the Nova Scotia Museum are quite good too. The other ones has a little bit longer, more illustrious history and perhaps a substantially greater amount of financial backing to assist them in their program. Now, perhaps I could just give a bit of a background as to the types of lakes where you would anticipate finding perch. And if you've seen the previous shows that we did on different species, phosphorus to begin with, and then getting on to fish species, you'll recognize the illustrations on the slide. And what these actually show is different levels of development, of trophic development within a lake. Most lakes generally tend to start fairly deep. As they start to grow with time, they tend to build up sediment, they build up organic matter, and essentially they fill up over time and eventually become shallow bogs and are gone. This was what was fated to be occurring to Lake Erie a number of years back, but obviously never happened. The illustration on the left is what's called an oligotrophic lake, so it's cold and deep. Now that's the type of lake you'd expect to find things such as cold water species like trout, specifically like trout in. The middle one is sort of mesotropic. That's where you tend to find fish that like, I was going to say mediocre temperatures, that's not the word. Moderate temperatures, a little bit more productivity, a bit more vegetation. Again, that's where you find bassin and perhaps walleye. And the lake on the right there, you can see it's relatively shallow, filled in. It's got a lot of vegetation in there, fairly firm bottom. And that's where you'll tend to find what we call many of your what they call coarse fish, so your panfish. And in this particular case, where we would anticipate finding perch would be in that one on the right, the eutrophic, early eutrophic type lake, or perhaps the middle eutrophic one. They're essentially a shallow water fish. You generally don't find them below about 8 or 9 meters in depth. Now, I have another slide made up of that outlines sort of on the trophic level where you would anticipate finding fish. And unfortunately, they didn't put perch in here because that comes from a book that pushes lake trout and bass. However, within that illustration where you see the gar, bowhead, and bowfin and bullhead, and just the tail end of the largemouth bass, that's roughly where you'd expect to see the perch, sort of the early to middle eutrophic levels. When you get very productive lakes with a high degree of turbidity and low oxygen levels, you tend not to find the perch. However, they're a lot more tolerant of depressed oxygen levels than things like trout are, who tend to require fairly high levels.
So it's not really food supply that's limiting the fish, it's more the more physical?
Well, that's you get into this question of niche, and the niche is defined by a number of factors such as temperature, food supplies, spawning habitat, everything has this sort of zone of preference, and different fish are constrained by different factors. In many cases, competition tends to be the main constraint. So food can be the constraint, but in this case, they're more tolerant of low oxygen levels, so they can use a lot more space. Now, the next illustration they have is a schematic food web, just to show you where most of these fish come in. And we thought we'd throw a bit of color in today. Yeah. The bright sun, actually, over on the left. Where you see the osprey-like bird immediately below it is a meat-eating fish. So that's the category of fish that we're looking at. Most of the prime game fish tend to be meat eaters. Things such as carp are not meat eaters. They're more detritivore type things, or suckers. They're sort of in between. We tend to like things that eat live things rather than things that eat dead things. So you can see where in the general scheme of things. So the meat-eating fish tends to be high up on the scale as far as fish come. So then we get to this question you're asking about food. What do they eat specifically? Well, as with most small juvenile fish, small fish, they tend to eat small things. So in this case, it tends to be small little floating invertebrates. Old doctors Needham refer to them as entomostraca. So essentially, anything buggish, fine. What's called now zooplankton. There's a variety of different zooplankton. Sure. As they get larger, as the mouths get larger, they consume larger pieces of food, and so you can see that essentially then they convert to eating insect nymphs and pupae and small mollusks, and as they get larger, small fish, large fish, depending on the size, and things such as fish eggs. And that's one of the things that perch is actually well noted for, is for its love of eating fish eggs. And it is suggested in some of the literature that this is indeed a problem, especially when you're interacting with species like trout. Everybody seems to say that. Everybody seems to really dwell on this potential interaction with trout, and I suspect it's for a variety of socio-economic reasons, as well as possible real biological reasons. The illustration that I have on the next slide is a poster that was produced by the Provincial Department of Fisheries within Nova Scotia, and it illustrates what trout eat in different portions, different habitats. Now, the reason I included this is because if you look towards the bottom right of the poster itself, you'll see essentially what are called slow water organisms. You will find perch in lakes as well as in portions of rivers and streams, lower portions. But what you see as part of a trout diet down there can essentially also be part of the perch's diet as well. So there's a bit of overlap in that particular well, call it a niche if you want, or a physical space. and as you get further up, as the waters get colder, you don't have the same productivity. So again, you tend to slowly start losing your perch as you go further up the stream. So until you get well up high in the streams, and then you're strictly into trout-type waters. Now, the other thing that biologists always like to ask about is spawning, and we won't talk about naughty bits because fish naughty bits are hard to describe. But when do perch spawn? Because if you remember when we were talking about trout, the trout tended to spawn. The trout and salmon tended to be fall spawners in general. Things like the bass tended to be May spawner or summer spawner. So when do they spawn? Well, in general, they spawn around mid-April to around mid-May, more or less. Because our waters tend to be cooler, we have lower thermal resources here, then we have they may spawn a bit later here, possibly as far as the end of May. It's hard to say because something that hasn't been looked at very, very carefully, although one lake was carefully studied back in the 50s. The second thing is, when do they spawn? Temperature-wise, that seems to be the driving feature. It's between 9 and 12 degrees centigrade, so fairly cool. Not like the bass. The bass spawn when we can swim. These ones spawn a bit cooler down. And where would they actually spawn? Well, in shallow areas. If they live in the open portions of the lakes, they move into the shallow waters. If they live in shallow waters, they'll move into the mouths of streams, or if they're in brackish water and estuaries, they move into they move right into the fresh waters to spawn. And they have some unusual mating rituals. It's suspected you have single females and multiple males. They all line up and they undergo an interesting ritual. They don't make nests, and essentially what happens is you end up with these little strings of eggs scattered around the environment. There's a doctor, I forgot his name for a second here, it'll come to me in a moment, Buck Newsom up at St. FX. He's actually been working on perch in Antigonish and specifically Lake Le Carver. And so he has some interesting information on that. And they also produce quite a few eggs, actually. They can produce up to 100,000 eggs per 110,000 eggs for a large adult female. So the females tend to grow much larger than the males do. What I thought I'd maybe just show is where some confusion might possibly arise. This is an illustration from Scott and Crossman of the yellow perch. It's a black and white illustration, so of course the characteristic colors are missing. And the next one is the white perch, and you can see it's somewhat similar in shape, but substantially blockier. It's thicker. It doesn't have the coloration. It doesn't have the bars, but the shape is essentially perch-like. And back when this one was discovered, they actually named it, put it in the same genus as the yellow perch as well. So just what you look for in the illustrations there is you look for the difference between the two, the bars and the coloration.
And the space between the...
And the space, as well, of course, in this case you can see the space is there between the dorsal fin and the other fin. So the reason I thought I'd bring the yellow perch into the studio today is because essentially it's a very common fish in the area. I took a look at the survey data we have for Halifax County. There have been approximately 180 streams and lakes that have been surveyed, or lakes that have been surveyed within the county, and of those 25% have perch in them, have yellow perch in them. It's a common fish this way. It's found in shallow waters. Therefore, you'll tend to find in shallow waters that are productive. So you'll tend to find it in around urban areas as well. So this is why it's not unusual to find it, say, for example, within the Dartmouth Lake system or in the Shubenacadie Lake system, First, Second Lake, Sackville, and things like that. And it's quite popular with the children. I remember when I was a little boy, I grew up near the E.D. Smith factory, and we used to go out on their...
or Ottawa River?
This is it's in Lake Ontario, but they got pure water, as it were, the processed water, and we'd go out we'd climb over their fence and climb out in the end of their water intake, and it was great fishing there. And you could catch, for kids it was tremendous. You could catch them up to about, 25, possibly even 30 centimeters, and good hefty fish. So it's a lovely little angling fish.
Is it a good fight? Is there a good...
Well, as far for kids, anything that pulls is fine. So It's also very rugged, so it's one that for those who wish to practice catch and release, it's an excellent fish for that, because it's got a fairly hard mouth. It doesn't have very large teeth as some of the other fish do. So you won't do too much damage to it that way. But it's also a nice fish that you can release. But again, as with other species, it's one of these cautions that you have to remember, is that you got to be careful that you don't transport them from one lake to another. And that's a serious problem, and throughout, especially the eastern seaboard, where our numbers of species is fairly low, because they can have adverse interactions with other species. In many cases, nobody's actually looked to see what specifically could happen. And perch, because they're so omnivorous and they seem to do quite well in shallow waters, could potentially displace other shallow water species. So I was going to say that this is one of the few species that hasn't been that's not part of the stocking program within the province. Within our province here, that they actively have been introducing a variety of specifically salmonids, and one of the problems is in the wild you only have so many fish. And if everybody goes fishing in the wild, then of course you put a high pressure on those fish and you diminish those. The perch is a nice alternative species or alternate species. My wife always gives me trouble over this one.
She said both.
Because it's one that you can use in fairly shallow, fairly warm waters in the area.
What's it taste like? Is it a good edible fish?
Yes, it's an extremely nice one. I was introduced to them actually in some of the bat work that I was involved with. We were at a place called Mount St. Patrick we were doing there, and somebody showed me how you can make them taste just like shrimp. And what you do is if you fillet one, you take small strips, about, I'll go back to the standard imperial system, say half-inch wide strips by whatever the length is you'd have on the fillet. And you dip them in a pancake batter and fry them on a hot butter. They curl up like little shrimp, and they're nice and tasty, and they're very, very nice. And they also tend to be relatively clean. In midsummer, they tend to pick up a bit of a parasite burden, but the rest of the season they're actually very nice, clean flesh. It has no unusual taste to it or anything like that. So.
Okay. My problem with fish is bones. Is the bony fish?
No, not as far. It's considered one of the bony fishes, but no, it's not a. It's nothing like smelt or or gasper or anything like that. So I highly recommend it for that. But for conservation purposes, it's also a very attractive fish. That it's a good indicator. It tells you that that your conditions, you've got enrichment in your water systems, and perhaps they're not as cold and clear as they originally were.
Mm-hmm. Go on.
Okay, well, that sounds fine. Yeah. One of the other difficulties that you run into when you get into looking at fish like this is that we should actually caution people. Especially, there was a fishing derby that's still being run, but they've changed the rules now. The rules used to be in one of the big lake derbies here is they would have a competition for the smallest fish caught. And so you get people catching these little tiddler fish and bringing them in buckets and saying, "Ha, I got the smallest fish." And of course, by which time the poor little fish is expired. So perhaps this is a good time to sort of reiterate that what you have to be careful is that you don't put a pressure on the populations. You don't take fish, put them in buckets and put them in aquaria, because they don't necessarily do very well in aquaria. There's some fish that we have here that will do well in an aquarium setting, but most fish don't. Yellow perch, no. Certainly not things like trout, or not things like salmon. Certainly, heaven forbid somebody being caught with an aquarium with salmon or trout in it. So other than that, basically, it's essentially a coarser fish. If you see it, you know that the lake itself has relatively high productivity. There's a fair bit of enrichment to it. If you're looking at the old phosphorus levels that we were looking at, sort of in the 5 to 10 micrograms per liter of phosphorus, so the middle type levels. Other than that, as I said, it's a nice fish. It adds a bit of color to our waters too. We have some of our minnows and our shiners are quite colorful, but this is a nice one because it gives you your dark olive greens and your yellows and your oranges all at the same time. So as I said, it's a useful additional piece in in our repertoire, if you want to call it that.
Okay, we have approximately 3 minutes left. Can I ask you about your research at Dalhousie University? Andrew's actually working on his PhD, I presume, with fish biology?
Yes, actually I'm working on brook trout and on smallmouth bass, looking at interactions. And actually at present, under the auspices of the Canadian Association of Smallmouth Anglers, I'm doing some temperature partitioning work with both species and doing physiological measurements on looking at what's called the scope for metabolic activity of the two species, looking to see how much they actually overlap at given temperatures. And hopefully this will be a good, powerful predictive tool to help us look to see where we might possibly find interactive problems. And as with the question of perch, for example, interacting with trout, the same kind of a tool could possibly be applied there, although they're a little bit further apart. The trout and the bass are a bit closer together in the scheme of things. So essentially we're doing preliminary laboratory work right now, and eagerly waiting for the water to get a little bit warmer so I can do a little bit more snorkeling, but it's still a bit on the cool side, even with the wetsuit right now.
So how many areas are you looking at in the field work?
In the field work, physical areas?
Yes.
I've got 3 areas that I've identified as having relatively recent introductions of bass and having had historically good populations of trout. One in around Hatchet Lake area, one up and 2 up in the valley. So, but we'll fine-tune those a little bit once we get these physiological measurements. That'll sort of give us a guideline as to what temperature regimes we should be looking at.
Right. So you actually have fish in Dalhousie that you're keeping, as you say, in aquaria.
Well, we have no bass yet. This has not been good bass weather to date. So we're hoping that within this week we should have some bass, and we certainly have some brook trout right now. And so we're hoping to. I've been doing measurements on the brook trout, and we'll hopefully start the bass ones shortly.
Okay. We're almost ready to close up. Is there any other comments you'd like to make on this evening's show?
None other than when you fish, respect nature. You know, we are living in harmony with nature, and if you don't want the fish, then be careful and gentle and put it back.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andrew. Our guest today has been Andrew Hebda. As I mentioned, he's a PhD biologist working on his PhD at Dalhousie University. And I'd like to welcome you to join us again next week for another In Harmony with Nature. Good evening.